Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Prince Pyotr Lapukin of Russia was awarded his country's highest honor for humanism because he prohibited flogging of people over 70 years old. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a strange omen. Sailors have always been superstitious, and perhaps one reason is the story of the Paris C. Brown. She was a riverboat plying the waters between Plaquemine and Cincinnati. While tied up at Plaquemine in July 1889, 2 rats were seen slithering down the lines off the boat. 3 crewmen who saw this, prompted by superstition, also walked off, the only survivors of the Paris C. Brown, which sailed and vanished. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
In a cow fighting contest in Aosta, Italy, the animals fight more fiercely because they're forced to drink a mixture of wine and gunpowder. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a dog who betrayed a king. A dog is man's best friend? Not as far as King Richard III was concerned. Mathé, the pet greyhound of King Richard, on the day the monarch was captured in the castle of Flint, ran to his master's bitterest rival, the Earl of Lancaster, and licked the Earl's hand affectionately. The dog thus becoming the very first follower of King Richard to switch allegiance away from his king. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The stentor, a water animal, has the most violent death in nature. It ends its life by exploding into minute particles. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about an unlikely death for a mountain climber. For sheer strength and bravery, and perhaps a touch of the theatrical, few could match Tita Pias. Pias, the famed alpine mountain climber and guide who lived in Cortina, Italy, climbed the forbidding Winkler Tower, 9,000 feet of sheer rock, with his 5-year-old son strapped to his back. Pias, who had climbed the steep, forbidding Beaujolais Tower 300 times without mishap, died in a fall from a bicycle. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Colonel Henry Mellish of Blythe Hall, England, lost $485,000 in a single game of cards. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the brilliant Sleepyhead. There are sleepwalkers, and in Canada there was once a sleep thinker. He was Dr. Newton Wolverton, distinguished Canadian minister. While attending Toronto University, Wolverton fell asleep after spending 36 hours trying to solve a mathematical problem. And when he woke up 12 hours later, he found the correct solution to the problem worked out in 50 pages of calculations, all in his own handwriting. Believe it or not.
Is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The key to the French Bastille, seized in the French Revolution, was presented by Lafayette to George Washington and has remained at Mount Vernon ever since. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the passionate pastor. Throughout history, gigantic acts of wisdom and revolution have been born in the church pulpit. Preachers, pastors, and saints have stirred millions. But what about the pastor who stirred himself? He was the Reverend John Otterson of Moncton, Scotland, who preached a sermon every Sunday for 15 years, but would become so overcome by his own eloquence, he would faint before he could complete it. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Duke Albert was so puny as an infant that doctors prescribed a daily dose of wine, a prescription he followed for 84 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the church that had a coincidental beginning. Man leaves the monument of his lifetime in many ways. A church, for example, is not uncommon. But for George Meyer, his monument had a touch of the ironic and bizarre. Meyer was responsible for the building of the Church of Neustadt in Schwarzwald, Germany, spending 20 years of his life raising the money to build it. Finally, on June 29, 1888, the church was completed, just in time for George Meyer's funeral services. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Marshal Suvorov, one of Russia's most celebrated military leaders, personally awakened his soldiers by crowing like a rooster. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a Canadian, Joan of Arc. Heroics in the time of the early wars with the Indians were as commonplace as the wars themselves. But one instance of supreme heroism belongs to Madeleine de Verachet, who successfully defended Fort Dangerous near Montreal against a fierce attack by 50 Iroquois Indians, aided only by her 2 younger brothers, an old man and 2 soldiers. She held out for 8 days until reinforcements arrived. Madeleine was a mere 14 years old. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Henry Temple was appointed chief clerk of the Treasury of Ireland, a $10,000 a year job, when he was 7 years old. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a trick pulled on Napoleon. The life of a double agent, particularly today, has been made as glamorous as it is daring. But imagine playing double agent in Napoleon's time. The Count de Blacas did. His assignment was to spy on the exiled King Louis XVIII. But instead of spying, he shared his spy's salary of $40,000 a year with the king. Later, he was made a duke by the king as a reward for his honesty. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Reuben Smith of Amesbury, Massachusetts, is buried sitting upright in a chair in his tomb with his favorite pipe and checkerboard. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the greatest literary award in history. At a time when Portugal was a world power, it was common for kings to give land to loyal adventurers and talented artists. However, King João III of Portugal believed in the big giveaway. The king was so enthusiastic about a history of Portuguese Asia, written by João de Barros, that he gave the author the whole state of Maranhão in Brazil, a piece of real estate 3 times the size of New York State. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
William Lilly, celebrated English astrologer, served as official fortune teller in the British Army to improve morale by predicting victories. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the prophecy that became history. Was it prophetic or was it mere coincidence? Did George Washington have that undefinable look of greatness in the making? Consider the facts then. Some 14 years before Washington was elected President of the United States, A special residence was provided for him by the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts Bay on July 2nd, 1775. It was a mansion in Watertown, Massachusetts, known as the President's Mansion. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Robert J. Ingersoll, famed 19th century attorney, charged as his fee for appearing in court $1,000 an hour. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a siege that ended in romance. In the long and exciting history of England's Oliver Cromwell, there is an episode of love and military strategy. Marie O'Brien, the beautiful redhead whose husband was killed fighting Cromwell, agreed to surrender her castle of Lemanoff, Ireland, to Cromwell's besieging armies on one condition, that Cromwell order one of his officers to marry her. A Colonel John Cooper volunteered, and they lived happily ever after. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Dr. John Kay, master of Christ College in Cambridge, could identify each letter of the alphabet at the age of 6 months. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a castle with a strange reason for being. Danger, keep off the grass, warning children at play, familiar signs in the 20th century. But one of the more curious signposts to be seen in England is a castle. It's the castle of St. Briabels, constructed on the border of England and Wales to prevent accidental crossings by Welshmen into England. A good idea, because an accidental crossing in those days was punished by cutting off the right hand of the trespasser. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
There was a survivor from Custer's last stand. The horse, Comanche, wounded 7 times, still lived to be 28 years old. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about an odd way to dress a harem. In 1611, Sultan Ahmed I of Turkey found himself in a somewhat embarrassing position as far as his 3,000 wives were concerned. It seems the Sultan simply couldn't afford gifts for the entire harem. How did the Sultan solve his gift-giving problem? He merely declared war on Persia for the sole purpose of getting hold of the gifts that he couldn't afford. 1 million pounds of Persian silk. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A law passed in Shaftesbury, Vermont in 1803 banned the teaching of grammar in its public schools as a useless subject. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you how an ancient tribe anticipated modern warfare. The theory behind the guided missile turns out to be not so modern as one might imagine. The theory, of course, is the missile is intended to hit a specific target, which is precisely the idea that ancient Britons had. These early warriors would rub the stones they fired from their slings in the brains of slain enemies, in the belief the missiles would have sufficient brains power to fly right to the target. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A well located in Great Valley, New York, actually inhales and exhales because of variations in barometric pressure. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a person who cheated death. Most of the great memorials built around the world are in memory of the dead. But there's a memorial in Edinburgh, Scotland that was built for the opposite reason. It's in honor of someone who escaped death. It's carved in the stones of a house that had collapsed, trapping a young man under piles of stone and timber. On the memorial, there's a portrait of the boy and the words with which he greeted his rescuers. Heave away, chaps. I'm not dead yet. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The first official act of King Henry VI was to approve a decree stating he could be spanked by his royal nurse. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a patriot who lived in exile. He taught music for years in Buffalo, New York in the late 1800s and early in the 20th century. But his heart and his talent were really in Mexico. He was Jaime Nuno, who was forced to leave Mexico in 1854 and spend the remainder of his life unknown to his countrymen. A particularly cruel fate, since Nuno was the composer of the Mexican national anthem. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A tombstone in Vermont reads, I put my wife beneath this stone for her repose and for my own. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who never seemed to grow up. Francisco Sicardi Hongo of Venice was the most incurable juvenile the world has ever seen. He survived 5 marriages, never suffered a day's illness. His eyesight and hearing were phenomenal to the last. His hair turned black at age 100. He received a government appointment at 115, grew new teeth at 116, and until the end, this venerable Venetian never lacked the companionship of a young lady. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Wickham Mill in England was built from the timbers of the American warship Chesapeake, captured in the War of 1812. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about doctors who moonlighted. Physicians have been responsible for many great inventions that had nothing to do with medicine. Dr. Timothy Bright invented shorthand. Dr. Nicholas Barabin invented fire insurance. Dr. James Sim of Scotland invented waterproofing. Dr. John Gorey conceived modern refrigeration. Dr. Richard Gatling invented the rapid-fire machine gun. And Dr. William Francis Channing of Boston invented the fire alarm. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Mahjong, the most popular game in China, was invented by Joseph P. Babcock, an American. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a soldier who worked magic to win a kingdom. A humble French lieutenant colonel won an empire 14 times as large as France, and not a drop of blood was shed in the process. This charmer of conquerors was Charles Parfait Montiel, who plunged into equatorial Africa armed with a mere 12 Senegalese soldiers, $16,000 in cash, and 24 empty treaty blanks. 27 months later, this daring Frenchman emerged, the money all spent, but with treaties that gave France an empire. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Benjamin Franklin did not originate the idea of the lightning rod. It was discovered 1,000 years earlier. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the greatest one-man job in history. He was probably years ahead of his time, and that's why Pierre-Paul du Riquet, Baron de Bonrepos, took on the construction of a canal linking the Mediterranean and the Atlantic at his own expense. Local authorities, unconvinced of the feasibility of the project, refused to share in the cost. So Riquet built the 158-mile canal and paid $68 million in gold for it himself. And it's still in use today. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The official flower on Father's Day is the dandelion, because the more it's trampled on, the better it grows. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about an incredibly loyal soldier. Records of man's ability to live out his life over 1 or 2 centuries are actually commonplace. But the story of Jean Tourelle of Dijon, France, is spectacular in its longevity. Tourelle served in the French army over 3 consecutive centuries. He joined a regiment in 1699, fought and served through the 1700s, and was still serving France in 1802 when he was given a pension by Napoleon. Service that totaled 103 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The famous 100 Years' War actually lasted 114 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a sight to send terror into those who saw it. Riding, 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 the great warrior astride his horse, returning from battle in Jhajjar, India, to his home in Bahu, riding hard for 26 miles. And what a sight it must have been, too, for the rider, Shah Ghazi Kamal, was headless. An enemy sword stroke had cleanly severed the head, but his seat in the saddle was so secure he remained on his mount, who returned home carrying the original headless horseman. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A mule named Boston Curtis was elected Republican committeeman from Milton, Washington in 1938. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the Never Never Gate. The gate of Traquair Castle in Scotland was slammed shut in 1745 and has never been opened since. Its owner, an ardent believer in the cause of Bonnie Prince Charlie of the Stuarts, ordered the gates closed, threw the keys into the nearby Tweed River, and vowed the gate would only be opened when a Stuart ruled Great Britain. But the Stuarts lost, and the gates remain closed, a symbol of a lost cause. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Marie Augustine, the Marquis de Pallière of Brittany, spent 50 years in prison, charged with whistling at Marie Antoinette. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about some facts that are really unfacts. A silkworm is not a worm, it's a caterpillar. A Mexican jumping bean is not a bean, it's a hollow shell containing worms. School chalk is not chalk, it's plaster of Paris. A caraway seed is not a seed, it's a dried fruit. A firefly is not a fly, a glowworm is not a worm, they're both beetles. A mosquito bite is not a bite, it's a puncture. And the French phone is not French. It was invented by Robert Brown, an American. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Natives of the island of Aran off Ireland fish from a spot that's 300 feet above the sea. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a grateful company of soldiers who saved a comrade. In Sackett's Harbor, New York, there's a structure that recalls a curious episode in the War of 1812 against the British. It concerns an American soldier, not a lofty monument to his bravery, but rather evidence of the fact he was a deserter. The soldier, facing execution for desertion, was pardoned only because he single-handedly constructed a drinking well right on the battlefield so that his thirsty comrades in arms would have fresh water. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Alexander Drummond offered to join the 79th Cameron Highlanders if he didn't have to start at the bottom. So he enlisted as a sergeant. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a courageous queen. Perhaps it was because she was a perfectionist in all things, or one of history's most tragic theatrical hams. She was Queen Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of King Henry VIII. While the Queen was imprisoned, she was told that the following day she would be executed. And in order to perform the function of being beheaded properly, the Queen asked for and received the block and axe in her cell so she could rehearse her own execution. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The Samuel Carr House in Jamestown, Rhode Island, is stone on one side, wood on the other, and nobody knows why. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the shyest women in the world. The familiar veils of the women of North Africa are nothing compared to the modesty portrayed by the women of the Comoro Islands near Africa. These shy females leave their homes only completely cloaked in a tent-like covering, an almost ghost-like cloth that doesn't have any openings, not even slits for their eyes. So they must grope blindly or be guided wherever they go, never to be seen by anyone outside the family. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The merry-go-round tree of Mumbai in Central Africa pivots itself during storms to withstand the force of the winds. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a place that remembers a horrible past. One of the most grisly and terrifying periods of English history was the reign of Henry VIII. Symbolic of this time was the dreaded London Tower, where princes and queens, dukes and barons were executed or left to die in chains. Even today, there is strange evidence of the madness of the early times. For the Tower Green, where 3 queens were executed, is now covered with paving stones because grass simply refuses to grow on the tortured spot. Believe it or not.